There's a woman who I think she was quite key in the Kaurna movement in the UK called Claudia Jones. And she said, a people's art is the genesis to their freedom, which I really like. And it's something about giving opportunities to people that we're meeting with to explore that, laughter, humor, unpredictability, imagination, the small and the ordinary things which are meaningful for people's lives. These are the things that are often overlooked, basically.
Hello and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told, a dialogue-driven podcast exploring how to create better social worlds through better communication. I'm Abbie, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Anokh Goodman and Rana Kökçinar as we take a communication perspective on super-coherence and incoherence. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we embody curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard one of our conversation partners today, Anokh Goodman. Anokh is a systemic psychotherapist, clinical lead, and training consultant in Leeds, North England. And our other conversation partner today, Rana Kökçinar, is a systemic psychotherapist and family therapist working in South Australia. You can read more about them in the show notes, and you will hear about them from them in just a moment. This conversation is a really fun one, and as we note, stretches across 3 very different time zones. So this was a kind of labor of love for us to make this happen very early in the morning for me, very late at night for Rana. I'm really grateful to have had this conversation and be sharing it with you. This language is so fun to play with, especially using a communication perspective. The work that they're doing around incoherence and super-coherence, which, I'll let you hear about from them in just a moment, is really helpful for describing a kind of shift that, building on our conversation with Diana Whitney from 2 weeks ago, shifts us to be integrated in the process rather than the outcome, or integrated in what we'll talk about today, kind of the being with each other. And that feels like such an important distinction, since at least my practice of a communication perspective is really embodied. And that feels like such an important part of it to me, as the distinction I've made before between other podcasts or other people that say they offer communication skills feels more surface level to me. That feels more like the having and doing that you'll hear Anokh talk about. I'm a lot more interested in the being of actually embodying a communication perspective. So I'm really excited to share this conversation, and let's begin with Anokh and Rana. Hello, Anokh and Rana. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation with me today.
Hi, Abbie.
Really good to talk with you both today. I want to start, like I am this season, bringing this back. And it's been a really great practice to bring back, to set the tone of the conversations. I want us to all answer the question, how are we arriving today? So are either of you feeling like you have an answer to that and want to start us off?
I think curious about this process. There's some excitement, which is to be expected, but also, and I wonder, Anokh, if you agree with this, but really wondering what I'll feel like on the other side.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm sort of arriving, I'm trying to maybe connect to physiological kind of embodied experience and also the environment. Like, I'm kind of aware that I'm tuning in from the UK, Abbie from America, and Rana from Australia. And interestingly enough, Rana was talking about having a fan in the background and wondering if that's going to disrupt the kind of audio for the listeners. And I guess for myself, I have got a fan, but it's on hot air, basically. So it's interesting that I'm freezing here, basically trying to keep warm. And I know that Rana's kind of connecting, and I can see Abbie in a jumper as well. So I guess there's something about the physical environment interacting with this experience as well, which is good to let into the room.
Yeah. I'm thankful for you naming all of these things. The way that I'm arriving, what's kind of front of my mind is I'm very aware of how my approach to these podcasts has changed over time. And I've referenced this before in earlier podcasts, but it's continuing to change. So there's some additional things I'd want to say. That the very beginning of this podcast, I would send like 10 questions to the person in advance because it was so new to me. It was such a new experience. And I was trying to really limit the uncertainty as much as possible. And so I was sending a lot of questions. I was over preparing, for sure, over preparing. And now, as I'm trying to embody CMM and not just talk about it, my approach has become so much more emergent and improvisational. And so, I sent you guys a handful of questions ahead of time. We kind of have had some conversation only via email. This is our first time, getting to see each other's faces and interact this way. But the preparation that I do on the front end is so much less, in a way that in naming it, I almost feel a little uncomfortable talking about how, quote unquote, unprepared I am in a traditional sense, because I know there's other podcast hosts that would make sure they've read everything you've ever written and looked you up and, done all the research. But my thinking is that, well, this is what this time's for, is so that I can get to know you and hear that in your own words and let you tell me. And we've exchanged some things. I have gotten to read things from you, but I have a fear maybe, or an insecurity around talking about how unprepared I am, because it feels like it's going to come across as rude or lazy, or like I don't care enough to put in a lot of work up front. That's been a really strong narrative for me as I'm like transitioning the way I approach this podcast. And so it's been a really big shift for me to actually, this is language that came up in another podcast I recorded, but kind of plan for emergence was the language that we used. And so it's very different to meet people. And I feel certainly safe with the both of you, knowing the work that you do, that we can recognize emergence as the plan. I guess maybe that's a better way to say it, is that it's not about being unprepared, but actually valuing the emergent quality of this, valuing what we can create together when it's not overly structured. And so I do care so much about how I'm showing up. It's just a very different way than I think what a lot of, at least what I could speak to, my culture would say we value around how we meet each other. So that's a lot to start with, but that's what I'm arriving with today.
I really appreciate, Abbie, that you shared that with us, because I guess for myself and Rana, we're super excited to connect to the audience as well and interact. Like, we're having a dialogue, or I guess trialogue, with three of us, but then there's also the audience who want to interact with this. So I guess I really appreciate that you've brought us into that kind of experience, because for me personally, I think, by being seemingly unprepared, we're actually preparing for the uncertainty of life, basically, which is the reality of, what we're navigating through, these kind of existential like mangroves of life, a twist and turn. So, me and Rana are really passionate to share some ideas about what we call super-coherence and incoherence, because it's actually through that emergence, kind of the soil that emergence grows, I think, in reality, rather than a superficial kind of structure. So for us, like, we might be seemingly super unprepared, but what I would say is we're actually preparing for the reality of complex life and human interaction, real interaction.
Yeah, I think there's a story there that maybe all of our work in a way touches on trying to change a little bit. And that story, that I think is what I was trying to articulate a second ago, is that being prepared is how you would indicate that you care. But I think we're all trying to maybe create a new narrative around letting things emerge, and seeing what we can create together is its own way of showing that you care, because you're being so present to the other person. I think I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm so excited to talk to you both. Let's pause. Could you both introduce yourselves? And I like to acknowledge that, you are full, complex human beings. We're not going to get to hear everything in 1 hour. So I'd like you to kind of self-select for us. What do you want us to know? What feels important? Rana, do you want to go ahead and start us off?
Yeah, sure. Anokh, I can't help but think of your your comment about we spoke before this and thought, what should we share in that spirit? In that spirit of emergence that you kind of already mentioned, Abbie. And I don't know. I'm sitting here and looking at I have all kinds of things pinned up on my walls and like a table full of, some may see it as crap, but actually sentimental things and various, off screen here. And I feel really proud, or just like this sense of warmth in thinking about like the richness of my life. You know how you said that, of like where, you're multifaceted people, and that involves so many things. And I think it involves being on unceded Kaurna land here in Australia. It involves it being warm here, and I can kind of hear some crickets and cicadas and things outside. And it involves, I think, a love for connecting with people in my work, in my life, and hence being super grateful for this opportunity and, the opportunity to have these conversations with Anokh, which we'll talk about more. Yeah, I think that's probably enough.
Cool. So yeah, so my name's Anokh, and I think in the spirit of what we're talking about, it's funny really. Before maybe introducing a part of myself, it reminded me, just as we're connecting with each other, about, I think it's a West African kind of story about, I think it's like called a Khan philosophy, I think, and it's this story about a 100-headed demon guarding this bridge. So it's the idea that every traveler who crosses this demon, the demon would ask, "Who are you?" in 100 different voices. And each voice would contradict each other. So there'd be these 100 voices of contradiction about who are you. And I guess the traveler, if he just gives a simple answer, so, for the super coherent answer here would be for to say, I'm a systemic family therapist, a clinical lead, and give a professional kind of identity of myself. But I guess the idea of this sort of tale is that you'll get devoured if you give the single answer. So I guess it's acknowledging that every identity contradicts each other. It's a paradox, they intertwine. So I might be interested to tell you that I'm a father. I rap in a hip hop band, and maybe perhaps telling you about my favorite crisps or favorite biscuit, which might seem seemingly unimportant, but it creates different conditions of how we could connect as human beings, as opposed to the usual kind of predictable, super coherent frame that we're often invited in, whether that's like visibly or invisibly. We sometimes just creep into these patterns of doing it.
Beautifully said. That makes so much sense. And I appreciate you naming the ways, even that in introducing yourself, you're naming the ways that introducing yourself is shaping our ways of being together. I think that's one of the most important things that I hope people can take away, is that when I'm talking about communicating, I'm not just talking about the words we say. It's not just the person talking, doing the communicating. I just think the space that we create is so important for the stories that are able to enter into that space. It's kind of, maybe a mutual relationship kind of back and forth, that the stories we share create the space for more stories to be shared, and on and on and on. But yeah, already seems like you're very much living this work that you do. So I'm so excited to learn more about it. Let's just dive right in. Can you tell me about these ideas that you're playing around with in the systemic therapy context of super-coherence and incoherence?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you can jump in, Rana, but I just really quickly wanted to add that when you was talking about the land, that, the location and the land, one of the ideas that we've been interested in is, an idea that, I know the body keeps the score, and thinking about the physical canvas, in terms of how trauma might have displayed or been, caught or trapped or moved inside someone's body. We were talking about how, I can't remember who came up with this kind of idea, but something about the land kind of keeping the score. So I think it's interesting for Rana to say that. And just before we jump in, it's just, zooming out into the wider context, so it's like the body, but it's like, okay, what about the land? What memory does the land kind of keep? Even your house, like what memory does the stories, the rooms in your house kind of capture or retain in their memory? So I think just before we're jumping in, it's my interest is like go wider. So even systemic therapy, I'd say our ideas interplay with systemic therapy, but they're not only restricted to the therapy room.
And I suppose jumping off of that note, because I can feel where I'm pulled in terms of our process that we've been doing, from different sides of the world, speaking of the land. I can feel myself pulled into a dialogue about, this is so strange because I'm going way off topic here, but in the spirit of emergence,
Yes.
about my lawn, which is the fact that I've heard some things that we're having a drought here at the minute. No one's named it as that. And I've had this funny relationship with my lawn recently. I sound like I'm in a therapy session, speaking as a therapist, but it's been just dry and horrible, and we have this huge backyard, and it takes so much water to take care of it, and we rent, so there's a whole bunch of kind of nuanced thinking that I have about, should I be taking care of this? But what you said, Anokh, about like the land keeping the score, and it's like I feel like there's this score in my heart about this lawn that kind of represents so much more than, I don't know, just a lawn in my backyard, being that it just feels arid and this weight that I have. And I guess it made me think of, like you said, how these things go broader than just systemic thinking. I mean, I think it would be easy in the way that you felt that allure, like Abbie, you spoke about, there's that draw towards the super coherent, like there is a natural appeal, or I don't know if I would say natural, but some kind of appeal towards that frame of seeing things where we can make a really neat box around something. But I think what Anokh and I have experienced, like in our process, but also then we're trying to describe it as well, is the pull in the other direction, kind of like the pull of the lawn, the pull of just this story or connection between different points. And even our meeting, I'm going to tie it in now because I will get to the point, which is that our origin story was very serendipitous as well, sort of meeting in this random training that I think was put on by the Australian Association for Family Therapy. I can't even remember. And sort of both going, yeah, that was all right. And then kind of just launching into this other dialogue for some reason, which I don't really know why, but it happened. And even that was, I think, quite incoherent, a strange process that was unpredictable and spontaneous, and yet led to the emergence of so much, including this conversation.
And connecting to what you're saying, Rana, that I know with CMM, obviously, like the loop model is something I'm heavily kind of interested in and utilize, but it makes me think about that lawn to kind of connect to what you're saying, that here, like, there's, I'm looking out and there's some really nice gardens like on the street, and I think when you think of the story lived and the story told, I think there's sometimes the story seen and the story unseen as well, in terms of if I was to have a wildflower kind of meadow in the front, looks pretty messy, right? Like people are like, God, he's not even cut his grass. Like, but my sort of value or approach or ethos might be to help nature kind of give it a kickstart or whatever, rather than just cutting the grass. But I guess the story seen is, really messy, lazy garden. Like, why doesn't the rest, everyone's, maintained it really nicely. So there's an interplay there where we're sort of surveillancing ourselves. We have this kind of panopticon almost view where it's like, okay, I know why I'm doing that, but it looks like this. So, am I going to kind of give into that story scene, which is perceived as like it's messy, or is it like I know the reason that I'm doing that? So I think we're caught in a lot of these dilemmas, crossroads, intersections of our own perception of values, and then how that's perceived or narrated by others.
Yeah. To me, it feels like the starting place for all of this is really about bringing people's attention to what CMM would call a bifurcation point, and just making people aware of, I think, the choices that they have. That's something I don't take for granted, that everyone is oriented towards seeing themselves as that active participant, that CMM would say they are, as having choices in the meaning made or the stories told. And so for me, step one has to be about awareness, in the work that you all are doing and these new ideas that you're playing around with. You're really asking people to think and show up in a different way. And so it's starting with okay, well, let me even name this moment of a bifurcation point. Let me become aware that there's multiple stories and multiple paths and narratives that are growing out of this, and kind of make a choice. That feels so important to me. And then I think having language around like super coherence is like such an interesting idea to me. I really, really like that. And I'm excited to get into more of maybe how you define that and how you're playing with it and how that's emerged. But it feels like step 2 in that language, even of itself, is like offering tools to navigate through those choices that are then presented to you that you maybe weren't aware were even there before.
Yeah, I love the way you've described that. Yeah, you want to jump in, Rana?
Oh, I could really appreciate that kind of, people having agency and choice and the importance of naming. And I think I don't really remember how we landed on the kind of coherence, super coherence, or where we came to with that. But I think, funnily enough, the pieces that landed were perhaps, in my experience, and I don't know what you would say or not, but quite experiential, like quite a lived feeling that took time to describe. And when we found a kind of experience near term for that I think worked well, we found that it became special in a certain way. Like we ended up talking a lot about Jupiter. And there was an experience where someone else had come in and named a different planet. Like we were talking about Jupiter and someone sort of mentioned Saturn, let's say, I can't remember. And we were just like, Saturn? No, that's not it. Like there was just this closeness.
Yeah.
And same with this super coherence. But I think it's not necessarily the closeness of the name. It was the closeness of the experiential kind of feeling that we got from these rich descriptions of what super coherence would be. One of the biggest things that stood out to me was we just spoke a lot about LinkedIn and about reading things that, reading something, and, government and non-government organizations are absolutely, I mean, any organization, any person, I think, can be there in the way that we feel that draw, that allure or whatever towards these super coherent narratives or stories. But the more I looked at it, the more kind of plain as day, I would think there's something so life-draining about these messages that are seemingly different or seemingly kind of creative or trying to do something new, words like community, words like creativity. An example in therapy would be something like what's called the miracle question, which is sort of like a solutions focused question that, that is all about, if you were to imagine somehow I waved a magic wand and the problem had gone away and you woke up tomorrow morning, what would be the first thing that you noticed that would tell you that the problem was not there? Now, we kind of got to this point, though, of thinking about how has that maybe just been really commodified? The way that we deliver that, the experience that we have, the space that we create with people in any way, even online, like on LinkedIn. How have we maybe, I think Anokh even named it, like colonize these ideas where we try so hard to do something different, but inadvertently we kind of do the same thing or we rarefy the same ideas. And I think the piece for me that stood out with that was the feeling that I got about that. It was just like, ugh, like, I don't want to do that. Maybe the feeling for you of like, I'm planning here, but inadvertently by planning, I'm missing the exact thing that I really want to be cultivating. But letting go, or I guess embracing the incoherence of what might just emerge anyway, I guess I found really fruitful, but I also feel it's taken practice between Anokh and I, and it's been something that maybe has had its own energy that's built over time.
For sure.
I think that makes sense that it is something to practice, because you're not, I kind of framed it, which is, as a binary, which it's not, but as a new story, old story. And then, maybe many other stories, or choice 1, choice 2, story 1, story 2, whatever, many stories, not just one or the other. But you're not just asking people to give up their clinging so tightly to coherence or super coherence. You're actually asking them to turn around and embrace something they have actively probably tried to limit in their life. And so it's not just like this neutral, like just let go of that. and just be, it's like turn towards this thing that has maybe been very scary or off-putting to you.
It's really nice because when I'm chatting with you both, and like when me and Rana have been colliding, we call it like collisions, like, there's something within the collision, like what kind of comes from it, that we've tried to retain in everything we're doing. So even when we've been invited to write or contribute towards articles or ideas, even with this podcast invitation, we've said like we want to retain the spirit and embody what we're doing. So even this, there's a slight invitation for us to say, hi, I've done all these things and I've got this status or whatever it may be. So in some ways we're commodifying our own sort of identity or status in the same way that community or the individual or family can be commodified in such a way. One of the things I wanted to touch upon was the way me and Rana met. And one of the ideas that I'm really passionate, interested, driven, purposeful about kind of infusing into a lot of my work, like in different contexts, is about like the untapped like power of strangers, basically. Transient interactions. So with Rana, we were strangers. We'd never met before. We sort of collided in this bizarre shrapnel kind of asteroid like collision or whatever. So for me, I think it's something I didn't reflect on my own life experience until I've been exploring these ideas. But I come to, so a lot of people, friends and people who know me would say, yeah, basically they're like, oh, if we go out or, whatever we're doing, I'll be the person talking with a stranger all the time. My friends, my family, my wife, God, like, are you talking to a random person again? Like wherever we go.
Yeah.
But I've never really realized that has been such a rich resource in my life. It's probably been one of the most powerful things, which I haven't really acknowledged what that's given me in my life, the richness. And I guess that the power of transient interactions. So I'm on the board for the Association of Family Therapy, so it's called AFT. And we had a conference 6 months ago, and it was really incredible, really powerful, connecting with people on a human level, really, really great experience. On the way home, on the train home, it's about 4 hours. I was talking with this person next to me. Took about half an hour, 40 minutes. I was thinking, okay, we usually use the bridge, the segue of the tedious kind of like weather, whatever it may be. The train is delayed, frustrated, the humanizing bridge to get to the good stuff. So we did that. We did a little dance that you do, the kind of super-coherent dance. We're both humans. We both pissed off that the train is delayed or whatever. And we jumped into this really powerful interaction, sharing these deep stories about our life. By the end of the 4-hour journey, the woman was leaving. So I got up and we gave each other a massive hug. Must have been like a 15-second hug. I think people on the train were like looking and they were sort of voyeuristically listening to this story, thinking this is quite deep, like rich story of human life. I think some of them thinking, what the hell's going on? They're like hugging now. But for me, I knew that I wouldn't probably see that person again. And there was something powerful about creation being new, transient interactions, especially when globally we have an epidemic, of loneliness, which is, eclipsing the world basically in many places. And I feel like particularly it's a strange paradox that we're so lonely. Even if we're in crowds or with people, we feel lonely sometimes. But I think it's bizarre to be so lonely and working in mental health settings where there's an infinite abundance of transient interactions that could give you such richness in your life, such power, like such possibility of being someone new and creating something new of yourself, discovering something new. So I'm really kind of interested in that untapped resource. I was just going to share a quote which relates to what I'm saying, which is by Gabriel Marcel. And he says, I know by my own experience how, from a stranger met by chance, there may become an irresistible appeal which overturns the habitual perspectives, just as a gust of wind might tumble down the panels of a stage set. And then he says, what had seemed near becomes infinitely remote, and what had seemed distant seems very close. And for me, that's it really. It's the irresistible appeal that blows this gust. For me, the stage show is the performative kind of synthetic social world which we often occupy. So for me, it's like when we have that weird interaction, like, oh, this stranger is not an alien. They're not subhuman, which a lot of research has shown that we we think of people as kind of not human in some ways, because it'd be overwhelming to think, wow, these are all human beings. So we just kind of think, well, I know my family and friends. The rest of the people, I don't know who they are. And I love that idea that the gust for me is like the stage show is wobbling, and we're like, oh, maybe this world, this show is a bit more synthetic. The social world is more synthetic than we anticipate.
Yeah, I love that example. And I think you said weird, and that's probably the right word to describe how people would feel about that moment, because I've done some of my own travel recently and can attest that it's become such a default or a habit, like you said, that we just put on our headphones, look down at our phones or our book or whatever, and we're just in our own world. So that is a real kind of disruption, engaging in conversation, and that moment, like you said, you probably never see that person again. And so that's really kind of beautiful and, lies in stark contrast to other interactions around you're creating for the sake of creating, really. Like you're not trying to network and get a job or any kind of anything from this person other than just being present to them.
Totally. I would say just make relationships for the sake of it.
Yeah.
Just make positive, fruitful relationships for the sake of it, and see where that journey takes you. I'd say that in any context, even if someone's trying to get the promotion, forget about the promotion, just concentrate authentically building relationships, see where that kind of takes you. I'd really encourage the viewers, viewers, interesting, I guess they're viewing the words that we're speaking, but the listeners, I would encourage you, when you have an opportunity, to hold this in mind. And there'll be that crossroads of Kindle, book, headphones, blocking the world out. Maybe just try and instigate that conversation, because me and Rana's ideas are heavily, I guess, integrated in these ideas of like emergence, taking the opportunity and seeing how your relationship with that person shifts at the end of the conversation.
I think, something that brought up for me, Anokh, and in your reflections as well, Abbie, about kind of, I was saying before about the visceral feeling of the kind of more super-coherence, and like the way that can have us, the way that I think we ended up sort of collaboratively describing that was almost like the deafening silence of getting like a microphone and putting it to a speaker. Like it's almost overwhelmingly like nothing, like it just feels absolutely unsubstantial. And I think what you're saying, Anokh, about the encouragement to kind of explore the relational terrain of the places that you go and the people that you end up colliding with is, I would encourage the sort of the feel, like what is the feeling there? How do you viscerally experience that? Because I think something that I've become more and more aware of with our conversations, Anokh, over time is the state change, the actual experience in my body of doing and of having these conversations, of leaning into these places of just random spontaneous emergence and ending up in a meaningful, connected, profound place that doesn't necessarily mean it's profoundly intellectual or profoundly whatever. And yet it feels that way. And I always think, like, how do we hold on to that evidence of why this could be not just useful, but just feel and experience something new and different and maybe joyous and playful, that gives us a reason to try. Like it gives us some incentive, because the pull of the super coherent, and, I think we can't deny that there are systems in life that we need to abide by, like we need to ways to live. And, Anokh and I talk a lot about, meeting minutes and just things that seem to drain you of all of the like why does this exist, and do we really have to be doing it this way? So, but we, but colliding with those things is inevitable too. But I really wonder, I'm so curious about what would a person's why be, and is it a moment of chance? Is it something that what is their why? And is that enough to motivate people to think about taking that chance to feel something different.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate you kind of calling out and naming that, like, what are you feeling? Because I can put myself back in classes that I was in college studying interpersonal communication. And the experience I had over and over and over again was less of, oh, this is a totally new concept. Let me try to like imagine what that could possibly be like, take this in. It was more of a, yes, like a recognition of like, oh, I've experienced that. You've just given me language for it now. And so I think that's, you've kind of described what I've heard, at least you've described your both having that kind of same experience of coming up with this language, and this distinction between super-coherence and incoherence is more of a maybe recognition in both of you of like, oh yeah, that's the word for it. And now I can immediately think of how I've experienced. So speaking of, how you experience it, I love hearing that story from Anokh of on the train, of wherever you were interacting in that way. I wonder if you have any other stories you'd be willing to share that might provide another moment of recognition for people about maybe experiences you've had before or after you've, named it in this way of being aware of that moment, that bifurcation point where you could go for super coherence, but instead went for incoherence or created incoherence.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the way that you've kind of shared your own experience between that, like recognition and then it becoming, I guess, more abundant in your perspective in a way. There's a Sufi poet called Hafiz. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I think it's Hafiz or Hafiz, and he talks about like the words we use become the house we live in. So for me, I love that idea. Like the stories are then cultivating like the environment. So similarly, as we've brought this language about, we're noticing the presence of this super coherence, incoherence. To bring Rana's example about the microphone connecting to the hip hop kind of reference, but like when I was started like rapping, I remember that just that deafening noise when the mic, and it's like, get the mic away from pointing from the speaker or whatever. Yeah, and that jarring. But sometimes, let's say in therapy, there's something of I'm an expert coming to speak with a family. This is not the frame I'm setting, but this is the super coherent one, which is kind of subtly present. And you've got some problems and you're going to come and explain. So sometimes that can be the feedback, the jarring nature. And I'm just wondering, encouraging people to think, how can you disrupt that feedback noise? Sometimes that noise is so constant. To begin with, it's like, wow, that's horrendous. It's hurting my ears.
Yeah.
But if you listen to that noise for 5 minutes, you probably wouldn't hear it. Your relationship would change with it. And I think sometimes we're living in this kind of noise that only when something different comes in or someone else says, what is that noise? It's like, oh, all right, that alarm's been on for like 5 days. I couldn't even hear it anymore. But there's so many examples of times where I've spoken with someone in a random moment and something new has emerged. There was one time I was in Thailand with my brother. This was about 15 years ago, maybe more. And we were on this small island in a boat. So that we were in this Koh Samet, I think it was this beautiful wooden temple. And we were with about 40 people on this island, only 40 people, me and my brother. And we went to a glass-bottom boat with one other person, started speaking with this person. Again, it's the crossroads, like, we've got a nice experience here. Like, do we need to speak with this person? And we started speaking, and it emerged that this person lived on like my auntie's street, basically. And he basically probably saw us when we were younger, when we went to Ipswich, where my mum was born. So it's this bizarre Truman Show-esque experience. Right. Getting freaked out, like, is there a person in the moon with a audiovisual equipment or whatever? But it was just bizarre that, like these opportunities open up and you're like, wow, so much can come from that. Yet so much of the meta narratives we're told about don't talk to strangers, stranger danger, like, so it's bizarre. I find that in a world where most of interpersonal kind of conflict is by, close relations, really, for the majority of the time. So it's a weird paradox to then say, beware of strangers. Yet the potential is so huge, I think, to kind of learn and grow and have reciprocal kind of growth from these transient interactions. The fact that you won't see that person gives it a real power, really, I think.
Yeah, Rana, any stories coming to mind for you?
I'm thinking about it, but I feel like Anokh is so beautiful, and I think there's like, I was imagining Thailand. I'm actually going to Thailand like next month. It made me think of the landscape in which that happened, like just probably the immensity of, I don't know, the water or the waves or whatever, and how that the whole kind of sensory experience of that would have been pretty epic. I just kept bringing to mind, I think, an example of within session, like with families and things. And I think small moments, and that I always think of when it comes to that strange interactions with strangers, I think a part of me feels that there's something really precious about the letting go of that as well. The not having to capture, the not having to kind of cling to the thing, because it's sort of inherent in the stranger part, in this inevitable maybe goodbye, or the 15-second hug. And that is no less profound. I keep thinking of this moment where I have no idea what we were talking about in the actual session, but I remember I was with a couple, and at the exact same time, clearly I must have said something hilarious, I have no idea, but they leant back on their chair at the exact same time, put their hands at the back of their head and let out this big laugh, and they did it at the exact same time as each other. And I could have kept, like, I was going on some point, presumably, but I just remember thinking, I need to point, like, because they didn't notice. They didn't notice each other doing it. And it wasn't like therapeutic, me trying to point this out. I just thought that's hilarious. And there was something really precious about that moment. And I think taking that moment and then going with that and going like, do you do that all the time? Like, what is that? You just landed in this exact same way and you didn't even know each other did it, and just letting the course of the conversation, take it from there. And again, feeling into that moment with them. There's this wonderful attunement, I think, that happens when we laugh together, and when something like that happens, that there's no control. It's just only this serendipity.
One of the things I wanted to add in, Rana, was I feel like we're cooking this tagine pot kind of stuff. So I'm just going to like throw another like flavor ingredient kind of in, just connecting to what you're saying. A lot of, some of the focus of our ideas has been around, inspired by various things, but also like Eric Fromm's idea of to have or to be, the being and the having and the doing modes. So I feel like when Rana's told that story, it's very much about allowing herself to be in the moment rather than to do. How am I doing systemic family therapy? And, very much like one thing that was struck by was this kind of cultural historical perspectives on being and doing and having. Like there's some poems around flowers basically. And I think the American poet Tennyson, speaks about like, I see this flower and it's really beautiful and I need the beauty. So I go and I grab the flower and I pick the flower and it's, I possess its beauty, but then ultimately it dies, it withers away. And then Basho a Japanese poet, has this idea where his poem is saying, I see a flower and it's really beautiful, but I can't interact with this flower because I'm very, it's of a different world to me in a way, is how I see it. And then there's another poet, I think he might be a German poet, who says, I see this flower, but it's dying. So I need to interact with it to maintain its beauty, to replant it somewhere else. So I feel like there's something of a, the being or the doing or the occupying where we want to possess. Even our language is embroiled in it, really. We say, are you having a good time? Abbie, are you having a good time? Rana, are you having a good time? So we're having the time, we're consuming it in a sort of way rather than, are you being in the good time? So I think even linguistically, we're sort of so embedded in it that we don't even see that we're stuck in a kind of doing and having loop. I'm going to do some stuff to have some stuff. I'll do some work with a family or a team, and then we'll have some outcomes. Then we'll do more work to have more outcomes. There's very little about the state of being, I think, and the transformational power, which is, for me, is underneath the work that we're doing, but we don't speak to it really, and we don't acknowledge it.
Mm. Yeah, that opens up so much for me. And as you both have been talking, I'm going back to what you offered before with this gust of wind and the scenery of the play shaking and, maybe kind of drawing your attention to what you thought maybe were the walls or the boundaries that are, oh, they're a little more flexible than I thought they were. And so, as we talk about being active participants that construct our social worlds through communication, it's, I think, important to do that pulling back that we've already talked about and zoom out on yourself to see your constructing of social worlds in the context of already constructed social worlds. And so it's this process of deconstructing and reconstructing or constructing something new. And that, yeah, just feels very important in that kind of same way of what you were just talking about, to zoom out and see that relationship that's happening there, the creating, in addition to the being and the having and the doing, and the creating in the context of the uncreating or the recreating that also has to be done because you already are in the social world. I think it's so important. I really want to draw people's attention to, as they're thinking about themselves as someone who gets to make their own meaning, how can you go back and do that reflection on the stories and narratives you already have internalized or been given? And how can you conceptualize those as just stories somebody else said meant what it means? And then you've taken that on as again, maybe scenery of the play that you thought was the Truman Show is a great example. You thought this was the social world, but the social world can be something different, and it is something different.
I just wanted to respond to say, wow, like I really liked how you've kind of absorbed that and what you've shared and created, and from some of the things we've been speaking about. I really appreciate that because, yeah, it sort of makes me think about, like, you can't unsee, sometimes it's like a Rorschach test. Like once you've seen what the blot is, you can go back to the blot, but you can still see what you saw once it's silhouetted. So similar to what you're saying, the stories, we can deconstruct, reauthor, reconstruct stories. It's not like, oh, well, they're done now and I've got this knowledge now and I'll just go on my journey. We can still revisit places, and redefine them. But yeah, sorry, Rana, you jump in, I think.
As you're talking, Abbie and Anokh, it reminded me of, I guess, one of the ways in which Anokh and I have some crossover, I suppose, is working with families. And it reminded me of the stories that people bring about therapy, and that they bring stories about their problem, but they also bring stories about what kind of relationship they're expecting to have with you and the problem. And I think for me, as someone who's earlier in my family therapy career than Anokh, it's been a really interesting process to think about these ideas of incoherence and super-coherence in that work, and also just of that being and doing modes, and understanding the influence on, yes, the effectiveness of therapy, but of the relationship, and how my positioning of being with them is, and I keep using this word, but it's an experiential invitation for them. I think they feel it in a different way, but then they also come in with their own ideas. And I shared with Anokh the other day that someone basically outright said to me the other day, I thought I needed to come here and convince you of something. But I realized I just need to come here and be, or something along those lines. And I was like blown away because this person like articulated my exact thoughts, and the things that we've been talking about, perhaps unbeknownst to them. But I guess that, it gave me shivers when that person said that in that kind of embodied way of there's something about experiencing that difference together, and you can invite people into that process. And I think what Anokh and I, maybe what we've done is sort of just we've mutually invited each other into some kind of process like that, and then realized and felt the difference and effects of that process. And I suppose that's really what change is for families, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
invitation into a different process for them to feel the effects of that process and then do what they want with that. Basically, they are there, like you said, the power of agency there, and having their own change in their own way and making their own story about that. I don't think it's necessarily on us to construct the story, but to maybe hold a way of being with them for something different to emerge. And I suppose I'm really explicitly trying to embrace this more kind of random, spontaneous quality in the work and see what emerges, because it catches people in a way that you can't recreate or you can't like force when it's authentic.
Yeah. Obviously, in this conversation, this goes beyond your practices, but maybe using some of that same language I was using of being aware of the social world you're deconstructing as you're reconstructing or constructing anew. I'm curious about how this work that you're doing exists as a part of the social world and also as a deconstruction of the social world of systemic practice and using a systemic lens. In what ways is this something that has emerged out of the social world you exist in of using a systemic lens? And in what ways is this maybe pushing the boundaries of that or creating something new?
Yeah, for sure. It's really interesting because if we think of the metaphor of the stage in the frame, I think quite often there's a phrase with colleagues and people who might be supervising, supporting, who might say, am I being systemic enough? Sometimes there's a phrase that kind of comes out in a way. So it's this self-surveillance, maybe like, am I being systemic enough? Sometimes I am curious about, is systemic being systemic enough? Like in some ways, because what I would say is how it's influencing me and Rana are really interested in sharing these ideas and some of our processes. We've been using a lot of collaborative autoethnography kind of research methods and stuff. So that's like a separate story, but I'm really interested in making research accessible and fun, basically, like creating dialogical research where sort of living entities of knowledge as well, rather than sort of replicating inequality sometimes, which, can be done through sort of some methods. But yeah, I was speaking about kind of seeking the emergence in the emergency. So what I mean by that is I think a lot of responses to crisis give birth to new crisis, basically. So sometimes the way we go about solving a problem in a family, in a team, in an organization, we're sort of generating more issues sometimes by our response to trying our best to fix this thing. So perhaps sometimes the problem is not to be solved, rather than we're not doing it right. We've not done it right. Maybe the whole concept of how we're perceiving this needs to be kind of reviewed, reauthored before. And I would say within sort of systemic kind of field, I'm really passionate about kind of artful approaches. For me, it's more art than science. What I mean by that is it's more about the unknown, exploring what we don't know, the infinite unknown, as opposed to analysis, neutralization. Like, it's much more about kind of reciprocal influence. And yeah, I think there's a woman who started the carnival movement I think she was quite key in the carnival movement in the UK, called Claudia Jones. And she said, a people's art is the genesis to their freedom, which I really like. And it's something about giving opportunities to people that we're meeting with to explore that, laughter, humor, unpredictability, imagination, the small and the ordinary things which are meaningful for people's lives. These are the things that are often overlooked, basically. We might say, oh, we'll have a little chit chat at the beginning and then we'll get to the serious stuff. Whereas I'm kind of asking people to think maybe the small, ordinary things in life are really important for us to be exploring in more detail. One of the things me and Rana have been doing, actually, one of the elements was we asked this question, basically, which we're exploring at the moment. It might be one for the audience to like have a think about. So we just had this image of like, and there was words, which was electron, flower, family, and Jupiter. Obviously, like, got a thing about Jupiter. And we just asked people, could you write down how they relate to each other? Electron, flower, family, Jupiter. And it was interesting because quite a lot of the responses were like, what do you want me to do? In a performative, in a assessed way, which we never asked that, but it's like, what I don't want to look stupid. What's the right answer?
Yeah.
The second question we asked was create a unique connection between what you see on the page. Express this in any form that you prefer. So our hypothesis is that the second question, however people manifest that, whether it's a story, a play, whatever it is, their relationship with that is going to be different to the original question, which is write down how they relate to each other in that super coherent frame. Because there's almost a subtle invitation that it has to be, there's a right and wrong kind of answer. And we was thinking about this in the frame of climate related distress, whatever language people use. Even the language of climate crisis, I find kind of bizarre sometimes. Like, I don't think the climate is in crisis. It's probably more of a human crisis rather than the climate's like, oh shit, like what do we do about ourselves? How do we keep existing? So yeah, we were really interested in this, like everything's going to be fine, don't worry, it's all made up, or the world is in a horrendous state and we need to act now. And there's such a polarity that to me is the jarring feedback loop. Sometimes it's like, don't worry about it, nothing wrong, carry on working, carry on cracking on, or the world is literally going to implode, like our existence on it. And again, that's a ping pong. It's like it somehow maintains. So what we were interested in is if people create their unique relationships with the environment, however that they want to do that, trusting that process will get us to somewhere better than it's good or it's bad.
Yeah, and I remember when we were talking about that, Anokh, I was sharing about, I'm thinking back now, but at least in my mind in this moment is there was a time where we have a lot of bushfires here, and there was a time where there was a fire just down the street from my mum's house, and she lives in like metropolitan, literally a couple of kilometers from the city center, and bushfires don't tend to happen there. And I there were all these experiences that are much more closer and much more embodied, much more relational, that mean that it's almost like my data about climate is in that space and no longer trapped in that just big feedback loop of like, it's all good, it's terrible. It's like, oh, actually now I've got this other way of interacting with this that maybe makes it more tolerable. I don't know. I don't even know if that's the goal. I'm not sure, but it's not that. It's less coherent than that. It's more this other space. That was one thing that I was thinking as you were talking about that, Noel. But I also think, the spirit of kind of feedback loops in terms of how we received those answers from the people that we propose those questions to. And there were answers that were, it was quite, this is what you want to hear, right? And actually the latter question about, create a new story or create a story you've never told before, or interact with this in a way that maybe no one's ever thought of, I think at least I didn't hear as much back. And that really had me thinking again about people's motivations, or why would they try something new when in my mind, and maybe in the spirit of our dialogues, and I remember thinking something like, oh, maybe I'll like bury the piece of paper in a certain spot, like in the forest, and like maybe I'd come back in winter and there'd be like a mushroom growing out of it, or like, I don't know, just letting those ideas flow. But I think in a way in the air, there's just not many invitations to do that, and people can feel like, oh, hold on a minute, what are you really asking here? But I think our experience of those dialogues has been incredibly generative. And I suppose I'm interested in the feedback loop of the listeners or the audience in terms of what would it be that if they told themselves a different story about this podcast or the reason that they were listening, or what brought them to doing that, or at any of those questions, what difference would that make? Where would that lead them? And if they wanted to give that a go, or even propose our electron, etc. question as well.
You guys are leaving us with great things to be thinking about and playing with for ourselves. The one thing that I want to name, just because we haven't used this language specifically yet, is that in CMM we talk about coherence, coordination, and mystery. And so mystery is like what was coming to mind as you all started to talk about incoherence, but that is not, you would have just said mystery. That language is already there. And so I appreciate that you're making a distinction there and say not just the mystery, the unknown, the explicitly incoherent, the things that might bring up some of those feelings of, "Ooh, oh no, this is incoherent. And my impulse is to resolve that. But how do I fight against that?" And so I really just think this language you're offering is so meaningful. And you just use the word generative, and I know that that's something you've said. Let's see incoherence as a generative force. That's almost like a rallying cry. It feels like, an invitation. That's an invitation. And for people, what if you saw incoherence as a generative force? How would you be? What would you have? What would you do if you could see incoherence as a generative force? So I just think that's really beautiful. Is there anything else that you would want to leave people with as we kind of wrap up this conversation, at least for now?
Yeah, there was just a couple of things. One, kind of in a way responding to what you've just said, Abbie, actually, which has generated some thinking in my own mind. In many ways, it's looking at just the places that in a different kind of way. So like you're saying, that kind of incoherence as a generative thing. I do a lot of work around inclusion, belonging across therapy in the NHS trust that I work. So it's in Bradford, very diverse kind of area. And, some of the language I've been using is about positive disruption. So again, like disruption might be perceived in a certain way. But what I was saying is we should seek positive disruption as aspiration. So rather than like compliance or, I've ticked all the boxes, positively disrupting our system, a bit like the soil, you have to disrupt the soil to plant something to grow.
Right.
So, in many ways, it's trying to change that language. I guess the last thing, I do love poetry and quotes and ideas. So I'm hoping some of them have been of some use and some of the stories for the people listening. But I wanted to leave with the T.S. Eliot quote, which I love, which is, "We shall not cease from exploration, and at the end of all exploring will be to arrive where we started and see the place for the first time." So I wondered, in the spirit of that, to revisit places like you were saying, Abbie, and see them differently. I guess that's the aspiration for some of our ideas in a way.
I was just thinking of dancing because I remember talking about this with you, Anokh, about I've really sat with the way in which our conversations happen and then they're over. And I don't really think about them. Like I think about them when there's moments where then they are brought to me, but I'm not trying so hard. And I think for me personally, and I suppose thinking about societal narratives, Abbie, you mentioned that at the beginning, the striving that we all have for whatever it might be. And I think certainly aspiring to things is important, but I think there's something really beautiful about, like, let's say the art of dance, which is it's so transient. It's here and it's an embodied thing that happens in the moment. We have in Adelaide, we have the Fringe Festival on at the moment, which is a huge, huge festival, like thousands of shows, and a lot of them are dance. And I always think it's such an inspiring time because you see these acrobats and people doing things with their bodies, and then they do them and they're in a space and then it's over. And then the tense of, that art piece is done, and yet it's living on as some story in everybody's experience that is taken away, and it happens in this particular time of year that has this particular weather and has this particular feel to it within the city that I'm in. And I think that so well represents that element of being with, and then being with the next thing, and kind of letting that experience or that process or whatever it is go in a way as well. Letting it be as well. For me, I think that's been just a thing that I've been left with, even with this podcast, letting this podcast go out and letting it be.
Yeah, that's a great thing to name, because you've generated more for me in these last comments you've made that I'm very tempted to comment on, but I'll exhibit some restraint there. Maybe the one thing, if I am posing the question to myself, the thing I would leave people with based on what the two of you have just said is the image that's coming to mind as you're drawing our attention back to the transient nature of communicating and being together is this image of like open hands and like hold the things because they're precious and you care and you're paying attention to them, but hold them with open hands rather than tightly like that flower, that you picked because you had to possess. If you can hold these moments with open hands, then you can have them and you can let go of them. Like we're letting go of this conversation. And I'll say what I've said on other podcasts, and I say it for myself more than anything. I have to see this. This is not a period. This is a comma. So I'm feeling so inspired to keep being with both of you. So thank you both so much, Anokh and Rana, for talking with me today and for generating something really meaningful, I think.
Oh, thank you. It's been a real pleasure to like just jump in and bring you into the spirit of like the things that we're trying to create and share kind of wider. So it's been a real privilege to kind of just connect and be together.
Yeah, second that. It's been awesome and just so cool that we can do this from different time zones.
Yes. Yeah, we're truly spanning the time zones. So thank you both so much. Okay, that is all for today's episode. But remember, the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. There are so many ways to stay in dialogue. First, you're always welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections, questions, and ideas. There are also a number of online spaces where you can comment, including the Stories Lived, Stories Told Instagram and the CMM Institute Substack. Links to all these places to connect are in the show notes. If you want to stay up to date, a couple things you can do are follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, share this episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation, and subscribe to the CMM Institute Substack to get every episode right in your inbox. Stories Lived, Stories Told is an initiative of the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives, including our other podcast, Cosmo Parenting, and all our free Cosmo activities, as well as Cosmopolis 2045. There's also the CMM Institute Fellowship and the CMM Institute Press. We have so many great resources that we are so excited to share. Again, links to all of that can be found in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.